This photo shows a wedding, but 40 years later it was labeled as evidence of a crime, and all eyes fell on one child. The ledger was already open when the candle flickered. Wax pooled along the spine, seeping into the paper like time itself, slow and irreversible. Outside, rain tapped softly against the cobblestones, a patient sound, as if the night were counting something it refused to forget. In a small records room that smelled of dust and old ink, a photograph lay pressed flat between marriage licenses and municipal seals, untouched for decades, unseen by anyone who still remembered the people inside it. It was the kind of place where history slept lightly, never fully at rest. The photograph was dated 1913, the year written in a careful hand at the corner of the mount. The paper had yellowed to the color of old bone. Its edges were soft, worn thin by time and neglect. It showed a wedding, nothing more, nothing less. In a provincial town where the church bell once ruled the rhythm of days and seasons, weddings were less about romance than order. They marked inheritance, duty, and alignment. They were events meant to reassure the living that the world was still arranged as it should be. Ink-stained ledgers nearby recorded everything that mattered, at least by official measure. Names written cleanly, dates underlined, dowries listed in neat columns. Witnesses confirmed with looping signatures. History trusted paper more than memory, and paper rarely told the whole truth. It never had to. Silence filled the gaps. At first glance, the photograph offered no resistance. It was calm, polite, almost obedient. The bride stood at the center, pale lace drawn tight at her wrists, her hands folded with the kind of modesty that had been practiced long before the day arrived. Her expression was composed, trained, neither joyful nor afraid. She looked like someone stepping into a future already decided for her, carrying expectations heavier than the veil resting on her hair. Beside her stood the groom. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared not by happiness but by responsibility. He wore his role the way one wore a uniform, stiff and correct. His gaze drifted just past the camera, already leaning into what came next: land, reputation, continuity. Men like him were raised to believe that stillness was strength and that questions weakened foundations. The guests were arranged with care, each placed according to rank and relation. Faces were turned forward, expressions restrained. No one smiled too widely, no one stood out. In photographs like this, excess emotion was considered improper. The era prized composure. Silence was mistaken for virtue. What went unsaid was assumed to be harmless. The setting itself reinforced that belief. The church behind them was solid stone, darkened by soot and weather. It had seen births, marriages, funerals, and confessions, absorbing them all without comment. It was built to endure, not to judge. The steps beneath their feet had been worn smooth by generations who believed that tradition was protection. Everything in the image pointed toward normalcy, toward routine, toward the quiet reassurance that this was how things were meant to be. Then there was the flower girl. She did not stand where she was supposed. She was slightly apart, just enough to feel accidental, as if she had wandered into the frame rather than been placed there. In her hands was a small bundle of flowers, their stems uneven, their petals already curling inward from the heat. They were not arranged with care. They looked gathered rather than chosen. Her dress was plain, simpler than the occasion required. The fabric hung loosely, as if it had been altered from something older, something meant for another child. Her shoes were worn thin at the toes, the kind of wear that came from daily use rather than celebration. These were not details meant to draw attention. They were details meant to disappear, but her face refused to cooperate. While every other person in the photograph leaned obediently toward the future, she looked directly at the lens. She did not smile. She did not blink. Her eyes were steady, dark, and strangely calm. There was no curiosity in them, no childish excitement, only awareness. The kind that comes not from innocence, but from knowing too much too early. It was the look of someone who understood the room better than anyone else in it. The photographer, standing behind the heavy camera, would later note nothing unusual. His job was technical. He adjusted the lens, measured the light, counted the seconds. He did not question expressions. He did not ask why a child stood apart or why her gaze felt heavier than the moment required. Captured what was in front of him and moved on to the next appointment. The priest signed the register that same afternoon. Ink flowed easily. Names were confirmed. Witnesses nodded. The ceremony concluded without incident. Bells rang once, then again, their sound echoing down the narrow streets, announcing continuity rather than change. The bride left her father's house that night for the last time. Tradition dictated it. She crossed a threshold, believing she was entering something safer, something stable. The groom inherited not just land but silence, the kind passed down quietly without instruction. The child did not leave. Life continued uninterrupted. Meals were prepared, beds were made, seasons turned. In a town like that, nothing seemed capable of disruption. The photograph was filed away, pressed between documents that told a cleaner story. It became part of the background, a visual footnote to a legal event. And yet something in the image refused to rest. Photographs are often described as frozen moments, but some of them are not still at all. They wait. They absorb time the way walls absorb sound. They become heavier as years pass, not lighter. This one waited patiently, sealed away from attention, gathering weight with every passing decade. When historians first catalogued the image many years later, they saw exactly what they expected to see. An Edwardian wedding, modest, provincial, unremarkable. They described it with efficient language and closed the file. There was no reason to linger. Archives are full of weddings, most of them ask for nothing, but history has a way of choosing its witnesses. One archivist working late beneath flickering lamps paused as he slid the photograph back into place. He did not know why. He had seen hundreds like it, yet something in the frame resisted being forgot. He leaned closer, drawn by a quiet tension he could not name. That was when he felt it. The sensation was subtle, almost embarrassing to admit. The feeling of being seen, not watched exactly but recognized. As if someone on the other side of time had been waiting for this moment, waiting for a set of eyes willing to meet theirs. He focused on the flower girl. Up close, the details sharpened, the tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers gripped the stems too firmly, the absence of softness in her expression. She did not look frightened. She looked prepared. Prepared for what the archivist could not yet say. He straightened, unsettled. Rational thought returned quickly. Photographs can deceive. Faces can be misread. Time adds meaning where none existed. He reminded himself of all this as he closed the drawer. Still, the unease followed him. That night the image lingered in his thoughts, resurfacing without invitation. The wedding party blurred in memory, but the child remained clear. The more he thought about her, the less she felt like a detail, and the more she felt like the center of the story. The photograph, it seemed, had been waiting for someone willing to slow down, waiting for someone who would not accept calm at face value, because calm in images like this is often constructed. It is maintained, it is enforced, and sometimes it is paid for by those who are never named. The archivist returned to the records the next day with a different kind of attention. He began to notice how often children appeared in the margins of documents without explanation, how frequently households listed unnamed dependents, how often silence followed questions that were never formally asked. The photograph remained unchanged, but the way it was seen had shifted. It was no longer just a wedding. It was a pause, a held breath, a moment where something unspoken pressed itself into the frame and refused to leave. The flower girl's gaze seemed steadier now, almost patient, as if she had known this moment would come, as if she had understood even then that truth moves slowly, but it does move. The photograph had slept in silence for a long time, but silence, like paper, eventually wears thin. And when it does, what remains is not the celebration, not the ceremony, not the comfort of tradition, but the quiet question left behind by a child who stood apart and looked straight into the future, waiting for someone to finally look back. In 1913, hierarchy was not something spoken aloud. It was breathed in, absorbed like smoke from a hearth that never went cold. Children learned it before they learned how to read. Servants learned it before they learned how to hope. And those born without names worth recording learned early that endurance was safer than questions. In houses like this, order did not need to be enforced with force. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the careful way voices lowered when certain footsteps passed through a room. It was present in who sat and who stood, who ate first and who waited, who was spoken to and who was spoken about. The flower girl belonged to the last category. Parish notes mentioned her only once in the margins as the child of the household. No surname followed, no age, just a vague acknowledgement that she existed, folded into the records like a receipt that no one intended to keep. She had been taken in after her mother's death, not through adoption, not through kindness, but through obligation. A loose end tied quietly, then ignored. She slept near the kitchen hearth where warmth was closest to labor and farthest from comfort. She learned quickly when to speak and when silence was expected. Silence, she discovered, was praised. Silence was safe. The house itself taught her this lesson every day. Floors creaked differently depending on who walked across them. Doors closed with varying weight. Certain rooms were never entered without permission, and some were entered too often by those who did not belong there. Weddings in such homes were never simple celebrations. They were transactions wrapped in lace and ritual. Land was secured. Names were aligned. Futures were negotiated in rooms where curtains were drawn and voices softened. Love, if it existed at all, was considered a private matter, secondary to stability. The ceremony itself was only the visible surface of a deeper arrangement. What happened in the corridors before and after was not written down. It was absorbed into the walls, into the heavy furniture, into the habits passed from one generation to the next. The flower girl moved through these corridors quietly. She carried messages. She fetched water. She learned which footsteps meant kindness and which meant caution. There were whispers years later remembered but never recorded. A child sent away from rooms too often. A door closed too firmly, too quickly. A voice that lingered when it should have passed. None of it was dramatic enough to become scandal. None of it broke the rules of decorum loudly enough to be challenged. In houses like this, cruelty rarely announced itself. It arrived gently, disguised as care, wrapped in words like responsibility and discipline. The girl was taught that obedience was protection, that being agreeable meant being safe, that questions led to consequences she could not afford. On the day of the wedding, the house was full of sound and movement, but even then the hierarchy held. Guests laughed softly, careful not to disrupt the occasion. Their laughter was measured, polite, designed to fill space without disturbing it. No one asked why the flower girl did not smile. No one questioned why she stood where shadows gathered rather than where light fell. Children were often quiet in formal settings. It was considered good behavior. In an age that prized decorum, discomfort was easily ignored, especially when it belonged to someone without status. Power did not need to raise its voice. Sometimes it lowered it, creating an atmosphere where dissent felt inappropriate. The evening unfolded as expected. Toasts were given, plates were cleared, flowers wilted slowly in warm air. By the time the last guest departed, the house had begun to empty of noise, leaving behind only the deeper sounds, the ones that returned when witnesses were gone. The bride left that night, stepping into a carriage that carried her away from her childhood home. She believed she was escaping into something safer, something more predictable. She did not look back. The groom remained, inheriting not only land and reputation but silence. The child stayed where she had always been, unseen once again. History would later pretend it had all been harmless, that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, that the house functioned as it was meant to. But the photograph remembered what the house tried to forget. It remembered the way the girl stood apart. It remembered the weight in her eyes. Long after the laughter faded and the flowers dried, the image held on to the truth that had no place in official records. It held on to the knowledge that some injustices do not leave marks on paper. They leave impressions in posture, in gaze, in the way a child learns to take up as little space as possible. And the longer that truth was ignored, the heavier it became, settling into the floorboards, the ledgers, the very air of the place, waiting for someone someday to notice the whispers beneath polite floors and ask what they had been trying so hard to say. The truth did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It did not announce itself through a courtroom door or a headline. It arrived quietly, the way buried things often do, slipping into view through paper and ink, through records meant to organize the past, not disturb it. In the early 1950s, long after the house had aged and the wedding guests had died, a clerk sat alone in the parish archive, surrounded by shelves that bowed under the weight of decades. The room smelled of dust and cold stone. Light fell unevenly from a high window, touching only what it needed to touch. His task was simple: catalog, sort, preserve. He moved through baptismal records, marriage certificates, death notices, each page brittle beneath his fingers. Names blurred together, dates repeated themselves. Most stories ended exactly where they began, then his hands stopped. Behind a stack of old baptismal slips, pressed farther back than it should have been, was an envelope with no seal. It had been hidden, not lost. The paper was thinner than the rest, creased and worn at the edges, as if it had been opened and closed many times before finally being tucked away where no one would look. Inside were handwritten notes in an unsteady script, household expenses, medical payments, small amounts listed carefully, almost nervously, and one line that appeared again and again, written with slight variations but always recognizable: care for the girl. No surname followed, no clarification. Just the phrase, repeated as if repetition itself might make it disappear. The clerk frowned, not because he understood, but because something felt unfinished. Dates beside the entries caught his attention. They clustered around the same period. Addresses matched a familiar location. A house that appeared often in parish work, respectable, prominent, untroubled. Then there was one note, written lighter than the rest, as if the pen had hesitated before touching the page. Doctor insisted, too young. The words sat there fragile and exposed. They did not explain themselves. They did not need to. The ledger alone proved nothing. Paper rarely does, but paper has a way of pointing. The clerk gathered the envelope and continued his work, now slower, more deliberate. He cross-referenced burial records from the same year. Child mortality was common. Names appeared and vanished with little ceremony. But one entry stood out, not for what it said, but for what it lacked. A child, female. Age unspecified. Death recorded months after the wedding. No funeral notice, no family listed, no grave marker assigned. Cause of death written vaguely, the way it often was when clarity would have raised questions. The clerk felt a tightening in his chest, a quiet pressure that had nothing to do with reason. He did not rush to conclusions. He simply compared dates, compared addresses, compared absences. Slowly an outline began to form, incomplete but unmistakable. He returned to the photograph. This time he did not look at the bride or groom. He did not study the guests or the church behind them. He went straight to the flower girl. Her gaze met his without effort. It felt different now. He noticed how still she was compared to the others, how her expression resisted interpretation. She was not accusing, she was not pleading, she was witnessing. The image no longer showed a wedding. It showed a crime hidden inside celebration. The smiles around her were no longer harmless. They were shields. The adults had not been ignorant. They had known enough to look away, enough to say nothing. Silence, the clerk realized, had been the true inheritance passed down that day. The groom's family, respected and untouchable, had ensured the matter dissolved quietly. No scandal, no inquiry, just a series of small decisions made behind closed doors. A doctor paid, a record softened, a child erased from memory. The clerk sat back, the room suddenly heavier than before. He understood that there would be no justice in the legal sense. Every name connected to the ledger belonged to someone already buried. Time had done its work too well, but something had shifted all the same. Truth did not need a courtroom to exist. It only needed recognition. The photograph was reclassified. The word unremarkable was removed. In its place a new designation appeared, evidence. Not proof perhaps, but testimony. The kind that does not shout but endures. The clerk sealed the envelope properly this time and placed it where it could be found. He did not write an accusation. He did not add commentary. He let the documents speak in their own quiet language. That night, as he locked the archive, the bells of the church rang for evening prayer. Their sound carried through the empty streets, unchanged from the day of the wedding decades earlier. But now, the echo felt different, as if the past had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The flower girl, unnamed and unmarked, had been given something at last. Not justice, not restoration, but acknowledgement. And sometimes that is how history begins to heal. The house where the wedding once took place does not exist anymore. Fire claimed it during the war years, reducing beams and staircases to ash, taking with it the carefully guarded secrets that had settled into its walls. Flames erased rooms where whispers once lingered, corridors where footsteps learned to soften themselves, doors that had closed too quietly. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to accuse and nothing left to confess. Destruction in its own way offered the house a kind of mercy it had never offered those who lived within it. The land was cleared, new structures rose elsewhere, memory moved on or pretended to, only the church remained, its stone endured, darkened but upright. Fewer bells were rung now. Fewer names were spoken aloud. The graveyard behind it filled slowly, markers wearing down under rain and time. Names once carved deeply into stone faded into shallow grooves, then into suggestion, then into absence. Families dissolved, lines ended. What had once been permanent proved fragile after all, yet the photograph survived. Paper, thinner and weaker than stone, outlasted walls and fire. It appeared in places where silence was treated carefully, in lectures where historians spoke softly, in archives where gloves were worn and voices lowered, in small exhibits tucked into corners never advertised loudly. It was not displayed as spectacle, it was presented as warning. Viewers were drawn first to what they recognized, the bride, the lace, the symmetry of the group. Comfort lived there, then their eyes moved outward, the guests, the setting, the expected story of order and continuity, and finally, almost without choice, they arrived at the child, the flower girl who broke the illusion. Some visitors looked away quickly, unsettled by the calm certainty in her gaze. Others lingered longer than they intended to, unable to explain why their attention refused to move on. There was no proof that she understood what would happen to her. No record of her thoughts, no diary, no confession. History rarely grants that kind of clarity to the powerless, but history suggests she understood enough. Children often do. They sense shifts in tone. They notice when kindness changes shape. They learn to read rooms long before they learn to read words. The way she stands in the photograph suggests awareness rather than fear, a knowledge that had already settled too deeply to be named. The archivist who uncovered the ledger did not seek recognition. He asked only that one final note be added to the record, not an accusation, not a verdict, just context. A quiet correction to the story that had been allowed to stand for too long. He understood that sometimes restoration is the only justice left. You cannot return what was taken. You cannot punish those who have already been claimed by time, but you can refuse to let silence have the last word. The wedding remains peaceful in the image. That is the cruelest part. Nothing in the frame reveals the harm it contains. The smiles are real. The posture is proper. The moment is beautiful. Evil does not always distort the space it occupies. Often it borrows beauty to hide within, knowing that no one wants to look too closely at something that appears complete. The photograph teaches this without speaking. It asks the viewer to question what looks harmless. It asks what was required to maintain such calm. Over the years, the image has changed the way it is approached. People no longer describe it as quaint or charming. They describe it as heavy, as difficult, as something that asks more than it gives. Some walk away with discomfort they cannot explain. Others leave with a deeper understanding of how easily injustice can be mistaken for order. The flower girl stands there still, small, unnamed, impossible to ignore. She has outlasted the house, the family, the carefully managed silence. She remains because someone finally chose to look. History, it turns out, does remember what people try to bury. It remembers through fragments, through paper that survives fire, through images that refuse to settle, through questions that do not fade simply because they are inconvenient. The church bells still ring, though less often now. When they do, their sound carries across empty spaces where buildings once stood. The echo feels heavier, as if it knows more than it used to. The photograph remains in its archive, unchanged, waiting for the next set of eyes. Waiting to remind whoever stands before it that history is not written by those who suffered most, but remembered by those who are finally willing to look. Some names only find peace when the truth is told.